It's March the 14th, 1945. An Avro Lancaster bomber rolls onto a runway in Lincolnshire, England. It sits so low on its gear that ground crew worry the tires could burst before it even gets airborne. Strapped inside its fuselage is a bomb heavier than some fighter planes, 22,000 pounds of hardened steel packed with Torpex explosives. The pilot, squadron leader C.C. Calder, understands his plane is hauling ordnance that 5 American B-17 flying fortresses couldn't manage. Not even if you tried linking them together. This isn't wartime propaganda or some kind of national chest thumping. It's simple math, engineering facts, and a core difference in how Britain and America handled bomber operations over Europe. The Lancaster wasn't just superior at hauling heavy payloads, it operated in an entirely different league of carrying capacity. When American bomber crews discussed what their planes could do, they talked about bomb loads in terms of numbers and area coverage. The B-17G, the most widespread version flying over Germany in 1945, had a maximum capacity of 8,000 pounds on shorter missions. In reality, on deep strikes into Germany, that figure fell to roughly 4,000 to 6,000 because fuel for the round trip was essential. Let's do the calculation. 5 B-17s flying together could theoretically drop 20,000 to 30,000 pounds of ordnance. But here's the part the numbers don't reveal. Those bombs would be spread across 5 separate aircraft, released from 5 different positions in the air, striking 5 distinct impact areas separated by hundreds of feet. The Lancaster, by contrast, could deliver 22,000 pounds to a single precise point. One plane, one bomb, one objective. What this capability made possible completely changed strategic bombing operations. Nazi Germany had structures that couldn't be taken out through carpet bombing, not because the Allies didn't have enough explosives, but because they couldn't concentrate the destructive force. U-boat pens featuring 23-foot thick, reinforced concrete ceilings. Viaducts constructed by Prussian engineers in the 1840s with stone arches so enormous they'd weathered 100 years and still supported heavy trains. Underground production facilities cut into mountains. These objectives shrugged off standard bombing runs. You could hit them with 1,500-pound bombs all day and achieve nothing except holes in fields and dead aircrew. This is where the Lancaster's special capability changed everything. It wasn't built to replicate what 5 B-17s accomplished. It was engineered to accomplish what 5 B-17s physically couldn't do. The aircraft could deploy weapons that redefined what aerial bombardment could achieve. And by March 1945, it was hauling the Grand Slam, a weapon so massive that Barnes-Wallis, who designed it, had imagined it before the war even began, but couldn't manufacture it because no aircraft existed with the lift capacity. The Lancaster turned the impossible into reality, and in the process, it altered the closing months of the European War in ways official records often downplay. Barnes-Wallis didn't begin with a bomb blueprint. He began with a challenge that standard explosives couldn't address. In 1939, while employed at Vickers Armstrong, Wallis became fixated on a question that haunted him. How do you demolish something engineered to withstand direct strikes? His solution flipped bombing theory completely around. Rather than attempting to blast through a target's protection, he would circumvent it altogether by attacking the earth under the structure. He termed it the earthquake bomb principle, and it demanded completely rethinking what air forces believed about explosive ordnance. The concept was elegant, yet devastating. Release a bomb from sufficient altitude, preferably 40,000 feet, and allow gravity plus aerodynamics to transform it into a supersonic penetrator. The bomb wouldn't detonate on contact. Instead, it would pierce through soil, clay, and bedrock like a bullet through liquid, drilling as deep as physics allowed before exploding. When it finally detonated, 90 to 100 feet underground, the shock wave would act less like a typical explosion and more like a focused earthquake. The earth would buckle and surge, foundations would fracture, structures designed to resist surface blasts would fail from beneath because their engineers never conceived of an assault coming from below. Wallace validated his concept on paper initially, using calculations that drew from seismology, mining science, and projectile physics. The bomb needed to be enormous, far beyond anything currently in Allied inventories. It needed a particular shape, elongated, streamlined, with a hardened steel shell engineered to withstand impact forces that would destroy ordinary munitions. And crucially, it needed to be filled with Torpex, a British explosive mixture that delivered 50% more power than TNT and had already succeeded in sea mines and depth charges. By 1941, Wallace had his requirements documented. The bomb would tip the scales at 22,000 pounds, span 26 feet in length, and demand an aircraft that didn't exist yet. The British Air Ministry examined his proposal and set it aside. Not because the theory was wrong, Wallace's calculations were solid, but because in 1941, no Allied bomber could lift a 22,000-pound weapon. The biggest bombs in active use weighed 2,000 pounds. Four-engine heavy bombers like the short Sterling and Handley Page Halifax were still being developed. The earthquake bomb idea was theoretically brilliant, but practically impossible. So Wallace returned to his workspace and created a scaled-down version, the Tall Boy. At 12,000 pounds, it remained massive by 1942 standards, but it entered the realm of feasibility if you adapted the appropriate aircraft. The Tall Boy entered service in June 1944, and it validated Wallace's theory perfectly. Dropped on the Saumur Railway Tunnel in France, a single Tall Boy penetrated 60 feet of earth and stone before detonating, bringing down the tunnel and blocking a German Panzer division rushing toward the Normandy invasion beaches. Now the Air Ministry paid attention. If a 12,000-pound bomb could accomplish that, what could a 22,000-pound bomb achieve? By late 1944, Wallace finally had his platform, the Lancaster, and the industrial capacity to manufacture the weapon he'd conceived 5 years prior. The Grand Slam was no longer hypothetical. It was real, and it was formidable. The B-17 Flying Fortress wasn't a disaster. It was a triumph of American engineering thinking, but it was conceived with an entirely different operational doctrine in mind, and that conception locked it into limitations that couldn't be overcome regardless of how hard engineers tried to expand its capabilities. When Boeing's engineering team laid out the B-17 in the late 1930s, they were creating an aircraft for precise daylight bombing at elevated altitude. The doctrine was straightforward. Fly above the effective ceiling of most anti-aircraft fire, employ the Norden bomb sight to strike particular industrial objectives, and depend on concentrated defensive firepower. 13 Browning 50 caliber machine guns to repel fighter attacks. Every aspect of the B-17's engineering served that operational role. Every aspect of its engineering also rendered it incapable of hauling super-heavy ordnance. Begin with the bomb bay. The B-17's internal weapons compartment measured roughly 11 feet long and barely over 3 feet wide at maximum. It was partitioned into two sections, separated by a structural support that held the aircraft's wing. This wasn't an engineering mistake, it was an intentional decision. That central support bore enormous structural loads, maintaining wing attachment during high G turns and hard landings. You couldn't eliminate it without fundamentally compromising the airframe. The divided bomb bay functioned perfectly for the B-17's planned payload. Racks of 500 or 1,000-pound general-purpose bombs efficiently arranged and dropped in sequences. But it established a firm limit on what the aircraft could physically accommodate. The largest individual weapon a B-17 could load internally was the 2,000-pound bomb, and even that demanded removing some bomb racks. Then you face the weight challenge. The B-17G had a maximum takeoff mass of 65,500 pounds. Deduct the airframe mass, 36,500 pounds empty, and you're left with 29,000 pounds for fuel, personnel, ammunition, and ordnance. On an extended range mission to Berlin or deeper, the B-17 required approximately 2,800 gallons of fuel, weighing roughly 19,000 pounds. Add crew, ammunition for those 1350 caliber guns, oxygen equipment, survival gear, and you're consuming another 2,000 pounds minimum. That leaves you with around 8,000 pounds for actual bombs. And that's your absolute ceiling, not your practical load. These weren't arbitrary constraints. They represented fundamental physics and the trade-offs built into the B-17's design DNA. The aircraft's wing loading, its power-to-weight relationship, and its structural engineering all balanced around a particular mission profile. Attempting to force it beyond those parameters didn't just reduce performance. It created safety hazards that could kill crews. American bomber commanders understood these boundaries. They adapted strategy to match what their aircraft could accomplish rather than demanding their aircraft attempt missions they weren't built for. If the B-17 couldn't haul truly massive bombs, then American doctrine would rely on formations of hundreds of bombers dropping thousands of smaller weapons. Quantity would substitute for individual weapon size. Area saturation would replace pinpoint destruction. This approach delivered results against many target categories. German cities, industrial zones, rail yards, all proved vulnerable to mass bombing campaigns. But it revealed its limitations against specific hardened objectives. The challenge wasn't just about total explosive tonnage, it was about concentration and penetration. Imagine dropping 500 1,000-pound bombs across a target zone roughly a quarter-mile wide. That's what a typical American heavy bomber formation might achieve against a single objective. The bombs would hit across that entire area, some striking within yards of the aim point, others landing hundreds of feet away based on altitude, wind, timing, and pure chance. Against vulnerable targets like timber structures or railroad marshalling areas, this saturation method worked exceptionally well. You devastate everything within that quarter-mile radius. But against a hardened point target, a submarine bunker, a viaduct, a reinforced shelter, you'd create scattered surface damage with negligible structural impact. It's the distinction between tossing a handful of pebbles at a stone wall versus hitting a single point with a sledgehammer The Lancaster, carrying a Grand Slam, represented that sledgehammer solution. One aircraft meant one aim point. And by 1945, specially trained crews in 617 Squadron were achieving targeting accuracy under 300 feet from 20,000 feet elevation. More critically, all 22,000 pounds of explosive force would strike at one location and penetrate to depths conventional bombs never reached. The destructive principle wasn't surface blast. It was subsurface shockwave and foundation failure. You weren't attempting to destroy the target from above. You were trying to make the ground underneath it quake and heave until the structure failed from below. Risk assessment was another differentiating factor between the strategies. 5 B-17s meant 50 aircrew members. If you lost one aircraft to anti-aircraft fire or fighters, you'd lost 10 personnel. But the mission could proceed with 4 aircraft. The American approach accepted elevated risk by spreading it across multiple aircraft and crews, calculating that formations of hundreds of bombers could overwhelm defenses through pure volume. The Lancaster Grand Slam mission concentrated everything in one basket. 6 or 7 crew members, 1 aircraft, 1 bomb, 1 opportunity. If anti-aircraft fire or mechanical problems downed that Lancaster, the whole mission failed and the irreplaceable Grand Slam was gone. But by March 1945, German air defenses had deteriorated enough that single aircraft precision missions had become viable, and the RAF embraced that risk in return for the ability to destroy objectives that mass formations couldn't affect. Economic efficiency reveals another dimension of the story. A Grand Slam cost roughly 4,000 pounds to produce in 1945. Expensive by British wartime measures, equivalent to multiple months' wages for a skilled laborer. But compare that to the expense of planning and executing hundreds of bomber missions against targets that couldn't be eliminated by standard means. The Bielefeld Viaduct had withstood 54 attacks. How many aircraft? How many bombs? How many aircrew lives had been invested attempting to destroy it before the Grand Slam succeeded in a single mission? When you calculate operational expenses, the earthquake bomb became economically sound precisely because it could accomplish in one sortie what might otherwise demand dozens or never succeed at all. The Grand Slam's combat history was short. Only 41 were released between March and May 1945, but its impact on weapons technology resonated for generations. When the war concluded, Allied intelligence teams spread across occupied German territory, documenting explosive damage. And what they discovered at locations like Bielefeld, the Arnsberg Viaduct, and the Valentine submarine facility fundamentally altered how military strategists thought about protected targets. The earthquake bomb principle demonstrated that penetration depth mattered more than surface explosive power for particular target types. That understanding didn't vanish when the Lancasters were decommissioned. It transferred into Cold War weapons research and ultimately into the precision-guided munitions that characterize contemporary air power. The United States Air Force, which had been doubtful about super-heavy bombs during the conflict, changed direction almost instantly afterward. In 1946, American engineers started examining the Grand Slam's construction and the damage assessments from its operations. The outcome was the T-12 Cloudmaker, a 43,600-pound American earthquake bomb that pushed the principle even further. The T-12 never entered combat. It was developed too late for World War II and never deployed in Korea. But its existence demonstrated that American military thinking had internalized the lessons Britain revealed. You required specialized ordnance for specialized objectives, and sometimes one enormous penetrating bomb outweighed 100 standard ones. The bunker-penetrating weapons that became essential during the Cold War were direct descendants of Wallace's earthquake bombs. When NATO strategists examined hardened Soviet command bunkers and missile installations, they recognized conventional iron bombs were ineffective. The Soviets were constructing facilities with 20 to 30 feet of reinforced concrete protection, often buried beneath additional layers of soil and stone. The only method to threaten these installations was with deep penetrating ordnance that could punch through the overhead shielding or, like the Grand Slam, circumvent it by attacking through the earth. The American BLU-109 bunker penetrator, introduced in the 1980s, employed a hardened steel casing and specialized fusing to breach concrete before detonating. Precisely the methodology Wallace pioneered 4 decades before. Contemporary precision-guided munitions carried the principle to its natural evolution by merging penetration capability with GPS guidance. The GBU-28, developed during the 1991 Gulf War specifically to strike Iraqi command bunkers, weighed 5,000 pounds and could breach over 20 feet of concrete or 100 feet of earth. The GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator, deployed in 2011, weighs 30,000 pounds and is engineered to eliminate deeply buried installations that no prior conventional weapon could touch. These weapons trace their heritage directly to the Grand Slam. They're constructed around the same fundamental principle that Barnes-Wallis proved in 1945. Make the weapon massive enough, hard enough, and precise enough, and you can eliminate targets that were once considered untouchable. The Lancaster's distinctive capability also shaped post-war bomber design thinking, especially in Britain. The Avro Vulcan, one of Britain's V-bombers that delivered nuclear weapons during the Cold War, inherited the Lancaster's focus on payload versatility over defensive armament. The Vulcan had minimal guns but could transport an impressive variety of weapons in its enormous bomb bay, including nuclear gravity bombs, conventional iron bombs, and later anti-ship missiles. That design philosophy, prioritizing what you can transport over how you protect yourself, originated directly from Lancaster experience. Perhaps the most enduring legacy is conceptual rather than technical. The Lancaster and Grand Slam demonstrated that specific targets demand tailored solutions, not simply more of what's already available. Modern air forces now stock specialized weapons for specialized operations. Bunker penetrators for protected facilities, thermobaric weapons for cave systems, penetrating warheads for underground passages. The understanding that one appropriate weapon can accomplish what 1,000 inappropriate weapons cannot. That's the lesson the Lancaster taught every time it departed with a bomb too massive for any other Allied aircraft to lift. The bomber itself is retired now, displayed in museums where visitors wonder at the enlarged bomb bay that once swallowed weapons measured in tons instead of pounds of. But the concept it proved, that payload capacity and weapon specialization can outweigh sheer numbers, remains ingrained in how contemporary militaries approach air warfare. The Lancaster could transport what 5 B-17s couldn't, because it was engineered to solve challenges 5 B-17s couldn't address. And that distinction made all the difference when it counted most.